So we're back to who is the FIDO Alliance. The FIDO Alliance is a consortium, a nonprofit organization, member companies from around the world, over 150 today. Our mission is to revolutionize online authentication by introducing open technical standards that will provide secure interoperation between devices and online services. This enables, on the device side, for innovation with usability. So you can get away from clunky experiences that exist today in both the password experience as well as the clunky experience with a lot of the multi-factor authentication options out there today. But the piece that we work on is the standardization between devices and online services. And then also we standardize for a pluggable authentication on the device side. So our standards do support any kind of modality. This solution set has been developed by many companies, but primarily the companies you see on the screen before you now. This is our board of directors, very specifically developed over time to represent technology innovation, platform companies, device manufacturers, biometric expertise, security token expertise, so that we have a range of things, and as well as, and especially online service providers that are going to eventually make the decision to deploy this solution for their own users, such as a lot of strength in the financial services and payment sector in the early days of FIDO Alliance. So the problem that we're solving is that authentication is insufficient today, as evidenced with all of the headlines that we see and the industry studies that we see time and time again, with billions of passwords and costs, $3.5 million per data breach, according to one study, as well as just the CIO office hassle of managing passwords and the constant hit on employee productivity. What the Alliance has done so far is we first announced the organization in early 2013, and then we brought out an interoperability testing program, the FIDO Ready program, at the end of that first year. This allowed our member companies to build products, test those products for interoperation with each other against what was not yet published draft specifications. Then in early 2014, we published our first draft of the protocol specifications. Later in the year, we saw several deployments, PayPal, Alipay, and Google in particular, across both UAF and U2F. And then just last month, we published in final form our 1.0 specifications, both UAF and U2F. The design principles that drove the privacy and security capabilities inherent in the protocols were that we did not want third parties in the protocol. This is a direct one-to-one connection. This is not PKI. This is a lot of public key cryptography without the infrastructure or the CA sitting in the middle. When you think about federation use cases, consider FIDO to fit in the relationship between the user and their identity provider. The relationship beyond the identity provider is handled as it already is with existing federation protocols. There are no secrets on the server side. The secrets reside with the device and are protected by the device through various techniques. And that helps against horizontal and scalable attacks. And we'll speak more to that in a minute. Biometric data is not required for FIDO authentication. There's a lot of FIDO scenarios out there that don't use biometric authentication at all. But you probably first heard of FIDO in the context of biometric authentication, especially in mobile, because it is a popular user experience. And if biometric data is used for FIDO authentication, the biometric information never leaves the device. There's no linkability that's introduced by the FIDO protocol, either between services or even between accounts within a given service. So when it comes to privacy concerns around being tracked online, FIDO Protocol introduces no new handles or correlation identifiers that would facilitate additional tracking. So that was a key principle that we set out before we built the specifications. The benefits for improving authentication are somewhat self-evident, but I want to walk through this a little bit because we did build this organization with stakeholders that represent online service providers as well as enterprises and consumers, along with the technology providers and experts that are building a lot of the implementations. So the benefits for online service providers, they can improve the user experience that FIDO enables. They get stronger security over a FIDO connection, and they get cost containment. And this really speaks to the benefit of having a single infrastructure investment rather than doing one-off integrations with the newest, coolest authentication technology out there. One of the problems that we ran into in our design phase, we wanted to make sure we addressed, was that you have that interoperability so that the integration costs when you want to provide your users with a new experience is quite low because you've already made the investment. So now with a FIDO compliant infrastructure, you can interoperate with devices that come and connect to you over that standardized abstraction layer. You don't need to worry about special one-off integration regardless of the modality. And in the enterprise, again, this is your path to either harden your passwords with more usable and more secure second factors through U2F, or replacing passwords with first factor UAF authentication and leverage some of the innovation in biometrics in particular. And also by standardizing, you're better prepared to deal with a BYOD world where your employees are coming to you and people in your supply chain with FIDO-enabled devices already, and you can simply provision over the protocol. And then for consumers, this is going to improve ease of use. You can do a simple gesture and authorize payment or make a transaction, log in, as well as interoperability, so all your devices will work with all of your services. And so the device you have will have that portability across all of your online accounts. And then the improvements on security as well as privacy, protecting you from those data breaches and giving you a authentication credential that's phishing resistant. So the flavors of FIDO authentication I've mentioned in passing, but here they are illustrated. One is the Universal Authentication Framework standards, which we position as providing the passwordless experience. Here you're presented by an online service a request to authenticate, followed by some local device gesture where the device is authenticating or verifying the user. And then over the FIDO cryptographic protocols, you are authorized online. The second factor is where you still have a username password key, pair, but the username and password can be greatly simplified because you're no longer relying on the password for your security. You're putting the security dependence on your U2F security token. So you type in your credentials, and then again, local device authentication happening with your secure token. Here you have a token maybe connected to your browser through a USB port on your device. We're also adding NFC and Bluetooth Low Energy transports for that. So then you touch the device to release its cryptographic process, and then you're authenticated online. So in order to achieve this, what did we have to standardize? We had to standardize the challenge and response protocol for both UAF and U2F, so that the devices knew how to speak to the online services in a secure manner. And we also, illustrated here on the right, had to create an abstraction layer on the device because we weren't trying to just standardize the use of one modality. We were also trying to standardize the use of any modality, whether it be iris, voice, face, or fingerprint, or indeed a PIN or a gesture. And that is, you can see evidence of that having been the successful strategy by visiting the FIDO website and seeing all of the different authenticators that have passed FIDO-ready testing. But that was a very high-level overview of what the FIDO Alliance is, where we've come so far, what our offerings are. But let's take a closer look. And for this, I would like to invite Dirk to talk us through how registration really works for both FIDO, UAF, and U2F. Dirk?
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Hi, this is Dirk. So at the sort of center of the various FIDO protocols, the two protocols that Brett talked about are two simple operations. One is called registration, and one is called authentication. And the purpose of the registration operation is to simply introduce a new public key to the relying party. And the purpose of the authentication operation is to prove possession of the corresponding private key. And so those operations are used to authenticate users. And here on the slide, you see sort of an overview of how the registration step works. We assume that the user is already logged in at the relying party, so the relying party has some idea of who the user is that they're interacting with at this point. And in step 2, the user's client device that they have generates a new key pair. We usually require that there's some user gesture involved, maybe a fingerprint swipe or something like that, that actually can perhaps link the key to that user gesture, so the key later cannot be used unless a similar gesture is performed. And then once that key pair is created, the public key is being sent to the relying party in step 4 here on the slide, and the relying party simply remembers this key. So if we go to the next slide, you can see this in a little more detail for the U2F version of this protocol. We're flipping around the order here a little bit. Now the relying party is on the right, and the client device that we call authenticator is on the left. But you can see that the protocol here is fairly simple. There's a challenge, a random number, if you will, generated by the relying party, sent to the user's device. They run some sort of client software, for example, a web browser, and there's an API available on this, let's say, web browser that allows the relying party to stick this challenge into the client software. So imagine a JavaScript API where you can say, make me a new key pair, and here's a challenge. And so that challenge gets then transported by, say, your web browser to what we call authenticator, which is the device that actually is responsible for generating the key pair. And one of the things that we do in FIDO is we mix in at this point additional information, not just the challenge that the relying party selected, but also information that the client software, the web browser in this case, knows about, like which web origin requested the generation of this key pair, for example. And so that information is passed to the authenticator. The authenticator now generates a key pair that it associates with that particular relying party. Brett already mentioned one of the goals from a privacy point of view was unlinkability across different relying parties. And one of the ways we achieve that is by making sure that authenticators generate key pairs for different relying parties and don't reuse them across relying parties. So the authenticator is going to remember which relying party this key pair was generated for, and then essentially outputs the public key and a little bit more information. In this case, there's a key handle, which is basically a name for this key pair that was generated, and an attestation, which is another thing that you'll notice if you read the FIDO specs that shows up here and there, which is a way for relying parties to know what kind of authenticator they're talking to. Is this an authenticator that has hardware-backed keys? Is this an authenticator that is linked to a biometric fingerprint reader or something like that? So the attestation that is part of the output here of the authenticator can show to the relying party this key pair was really generated in this kind of device. And so the public key, the key handle, which is sort of the name for the public key, and the attestation cert and the signature over all this gets now output again by the browser, if you will, for example, as the result of this JavaScript call that I talked about a moment ago, and then sent to the relying party. And you can see in the diagram, it says on the lower right corner there, it says cookie, which, you know, it's a shorthand for saying that we assume that the user is already authenticated here. One of the things in FIDO is, and Brett mentioned this already, there's no CAs here. The keys that are generated don't come with any identity. There's no certificate that says who the user is and so forth. It's simply a naked public key, if you will. And the relying party has to link that public key with user identity in some way that is out of scope for FIDO. So in this example here on the slide, I assume that the user is already logged in somehow, shown by the cookie. And then the relying party simply stores the public key and associates that with the user account. If we go to the next slide. So this is the flow in UAF, which is the other protocol that we have in FIDO. This one, UAF, is allows for more use cases. U2F is sort of designed to support a two-factor login. It's a little more limited in what it can do, but also it's a little simpler. So you can see here that the general flow in UAF is very similar. There's a couple more parameters here and there, but the general flow and the goal of the operation to introduce a public key to the relying party is exactly the same. If we go to the next slide. So I'm going to hand it over now to Rolf Lindemann from Knock Knock Labs, who's going to talk through the login flows.
Thanks, Doug. So my name is Rolf. We will look into the FIDO login user experience here. We are showing a web-based use case here. First thing, user has a web browser, goes to a website. The website wants to authenticate that user. So essentially, that website will detect that there's FIDO support in that web browser on the device of that user. So it will generate a challenge, essentially, which is sent to the user's device, which is sent step 2. The user somehow presents a gesture, maybe just swipes a finger on a fingerprint sensor or pushes a button or something which cannot be emulated by malware. Then the authenticator selects the correct key related to that relying party. So we can protect against all these phishing approaches because the software selects the correct key. And then with that key, it computes a response to that challenge, which the client received from the relying party. And this signed response is then sent back, and the login is complete in step 4. So next slide, please. So in more detail, and can we skip that slide? I think I want to start with UAF. Yes, thanks. This is a cryptographic view of that operation. So we have the relying party again on the right-hand side, which generates a policy, a challenge, and provides an app ID, which identifies the application of that relying party. The policy allows the relying party to support different or require different security levels of authenticators for different operations. So the policy might be I accept any authenticator, or it might be I only accept authenticators with hardware-backed keys or with fingerprint user verification method, and so on. So that's left to the relying party to decide how to define that policy. The FIDO client in the middle will select the authenticator, the appropriate one according to that policy, verifies the app ID, gets some additional TLS binding or channel binding information, TLS data, which the authenticator will sign in addition to all other information, so the relying party has a way to verify that the TLS endpoint was really the one which relates to the channel or the impression of the relying party of that channel. So the FIDO client does a couple of operations, especially computing FCP, which we call a final challenge parameter, which is essentially a hash of the app ID, the challenge generated by the relying party, a facet ID, and the TLS binding data, and then sends over that information to the related authenticator. The authenticator takes all that information, verifies that the right user is present to whatever method the authenticator was implemented against. Then uses the key to generate a response, and in that response we will see the final challenge again, a nonce value, which is just a random value generated by the authenticator, some counter, which is increased for every signature we use to make sure that the relying party can detect cloned authenticators, and of course the signature over that information. And this information generated by the authenticator is handed over to the FIDO client, which essentially sends the same information to the relying party over the normal channel. The relying party looks up the information in its database, especially the public key related to that user, which is included in that record, encoded in that record somehow, so that then at that point in time the relying party knows what user it is, can verify the signature and verify that the policy is indeed met by that authenticator, and then set again a cookie that the user has now a strongly authenticated session. So that's essentially the same. And if you can go back one slide, we see the same operation for U2F, and just by first visual check, you see that it's very similar. There are a few subtle differences, like there's no policy, for example, but in general, it's the same approach. It's the same security strengths we can achieve with both operations. So now I think 2 slides forward. So now when thinking about the security of the protocol, it's very important to understand the different levels of attacks we have seen in the past, and Brett already mentioned some of those attacks in the early slides. And the most common attack we have seen recently was what we would call a remotely attacking central servers, which is indicated by number 1. So an attack where the attacker really goes to the central server and steals millions, hundreds of millions of user passwords. Just by the way we have designed the FIDO protocol, there is no secrets on the server side, so it's not possible for an attacker to steal all the secrets from a server side, which could be used to impersonate the user. But there are other attacks, and we have countermeasures in FIDO as well for those things. For example, an attacker could try to hack user devices to steal the keys we use in FIDO for authentication. And of course, we require the authenticators to have proper countermeasures. But these countermeasures will be specific to the FIDO authenticator, the specific FIDO authenticator you have. But it's relatively easy to implement authenticators, especially with dedicated hardware or in trusted execution environments, which prevent sufficient protection that stealing of the keys is not possible for malware, which sits on the user's device in the rich operating system. Number 3 is, instead of stealing the key, you could try to misuse that key. And again, this is very difficult if you use channel binding and all these other methods, because the relying party in the end would notice that the attacker sits on a different endpoint of the TLS channel than the user, which the relying party would expect. And number 4 is again a very interesting attack where you could misuse a session once it's authenticated. And after, let's say, adding protection against all these scalable attacks, so attacks which can be done by malware, which you can send over the internet to address millions of client systems, to infect millions of client systems, then of course we also have the potential for physical attacks, which you could do on the lost or the stolen devices. And just to give you one indication, it's approximately 3% in the US in 2013, the stolen and lost mobile devices in total. And of course, if you have such a stolen device, you could try to create a rubber finger or steal the private key from the device using a lab, so more advanced technologies. But it's very important to keep in mind that the scalable attacks are the important ones as of today, even though authenticators could be implemented to protect even against attacks number 5 and 6. But the security of the authenticator is visible to the relying party through a cryptographic proof called attestation. And that's very important to keep in mind. that the relying party can get a very good idea, the cryptographic proof of the security characteristic of that authenticator. And now I want to hand over, I think, to Tom Ritter now to continue with the security analysis.
Thanks, Rolf. So as Rolf mentioned, my name is Tom Ritter, and I head up the Cryptography Services Group, which is a practice offering of iSEC partners. And on the next slide, I'll give you a little bit of background on who we are. So iSEC Partners has been a security consultancy in the United States since about 2004. We've focused on application and network security with a smattering of other services, and we've tested applications and services that go up and down the stack from web apps and mobile apps to operating system kernels and hypervisors. We've also led the industry in research, presenting dozens of times at Black Hat and other top-tier security conferences. And in 2010, iSEC was acquired by NCC Group, which brought in a large portfolio of other security offerings, including PCI and other compliance testing, software escrow, and more automated managed services, all designed to kind of be a one-stop shop for both application security, like iSEC specializes in, to the other needs of a business in the realm of security and assurance. And on the next slide, in 2012, if you can advance one slide. One Mac. Sorry. Perfect. In 2012, NCC Group also bought Matasano Security and Intrepidus Group. And since then, we've kind of seen an uptick in the number of requests that we'd been getting for specialized cryptography reviews. And iSEC had always done a few of these a year. Matasano had a wealth of experience and reputation in that area. So it kind of made sense to break it out into its own practice, which we did last year. And Cryptography Services exclusively does crypto assessments. And the team is able to build on our application security background and kind of weave in our passion for crypto. So crypto is what we do all day, every day. If we're not on an engagement for a customer, we're tracking the latest developments in standards bodies, in industry, or in academia, and we're conducting small and large research projects, kind of poking at interesting things that we find. And we actually spun that out into a subscription bulletin service. So if that interests you, I can talk to you about it later. And we think that the FIDO specifications are a pretty good example of some of the work that we do, reviewing custom cryptographic protocols and specifications. You know, some of the other things that we do is look at an organization's use of crypto in their disparate code bases, look at PII protection mechanisms and data vaults. We vet open and closed source crypto libraries and things along those lines. So on the next slide, I'll talk about why we're actually here. It's pretty uncommon for us to participate in a webinar like this. We're naturally pretty neutral when it comes to clients and solutions that they've developed, but we've worked with the FIDO Alliance for some time, and we think this is a good fit. For one, we want to make the internet a safer and more secure place. We support most, if not all, efforts to strengthen security protocols, site security, and provide strong protections for users. And I think it's plain to see that the web needs robust and resilient authentication mechanisms. And while we're certainly moving in that direction, it's been a pretty haphazard movement. There's not a lot of coordination between the different players. So we really appreciate the manner in which FIDO is doing this. Open standards, open specifications, ability for folks to be in control of their own data. So on the next slide, let's actually talk about the technology. So we looked at the UAF and the U2F protocols in FIDO. And one of the main things that we were looking for was cryptographic attacks, ways to weaken or subvert the protocol. Obviously, weak encryption algorithms or modes of operations would be bad, but those are fairly easy to spot. We were more concerned with invalid state transitions, where a relying party like a bank makes a decision that they shouldn't have made yet based off of the data they received from the user. And making sure that all the data that's been posted up from the client and from the FIDO device is properly authenticated and relevant. If a field isn't covered by a device's signature, it could be modified by an attacker and could potentially result in a breakdown of security. So aside from those types of attacks, we're also looking at replay attacks, impersonation, creative ways to perform denial of service on the system, or otherwise trick a relying party. And then on the other side of the coin, we looked at the specifications and the supporting documentation that FIDO has produced, and we tried to find things that could be misinterpreted, ambiguous, or were just incorrect. And relying parties and solution providers are going to be relying on this documentation to develop their own products, and if something is incorrect or underspecified, it could jeopardize the system that they deploy. And we also want FIDO to be upfront and forthright with the attacks that the system does and doesn't protect against. FIDO has put a lot of effort into how to classify attacks and which specific mitigations are present in the system. If any individual security mechanism fails, you can actually use the documentation to get a pretty accurate picture of what attacks then become possible. So what we found on the next slide is that FIDO has done a pretty good job. We didn't find any real protocol weaknesses. The data that's passed and signed in the protocol, which combined with the metadata regarding any individual FIDO device, which in turn is attested to by the device, it gives you a really good picture of user presence, intent, and authentication. And it allows a relying party to detect something odd that's happening. So this would be like a device that seems to not support the version of the protocol that it really should. FIDO can protect against downgrade attacks like that. We had a few concerns with the documentation that are probably a little bit nitpicky, like how to treat content inspecting proxies or other corner cases. And we were able to think of a few attack scenarios that weren't explicitly enumerated. But these were kind of more esoteric attacks in strange situations than anything else. So overall, we were impressed with the thoroughness of FIDO's documentation, and we think that the UAF and the U2F protocols will be a useful layer of additional authentication for the web. So I'm excited to see them rolled out and supported in more places. So I think at this point I can hand it back over to Debbie to coordinate the Q&A session.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks everybody for your patience. We've got a few questions in. They're specifically about the specification, so let me go ahead and go through. The first question is, at what stage is the user device ID identified to the server for mutual device server authentication, and is the device ID hardware rooted?
Well, maybe we start with what is a device ID. So we have an authenticator model number, we have an attestation key, and they are not specific to a particular authenticator, but to a model of authenticator. So it does not allow, let's say, a violation of privacy. And the identification of the authenticator model is possible for the relying party at registration time. So once the relying party sees the attestation object included in the registration response, it can analyze it, verify the attestation, and after this verification, the relying party has a cryptographic proof about the model, the identity of that authenticator. Not an individual authenticator, so it could not tell apart whether this is the same authenticator, both belonging, let's say, to Bob, or if the relying party has seen two different authenticators belonging to two different persons. So it's not violating privacy, but identifying the model of the authenticator. That's possible after registration.
Thank you, Rolf. The next question we have is, why is this better than SMS codes?
Brett. Yeah, why don't I just start? Yeah, I'll start. So there are two driving factors for everything that we do in the FIDO Alliance to improve usability and security. And that third factor is, to do no harm, introduce no new risk for privacy. So it's better than SMS from a usability perspective, depending on the actual authenticator implementation. But if you are touching a button as opposed to waiting for a code, finding the code on another device, or trying to read the code at the top of your mobile device in order to type it in, these are all usability challenges that, we as a consortium of companies trying to roll these things out to consumers feel are holding back the adoption of strong authentication. So the usability piece should not be underestimated, and it is absolutely at the forefront of what we're designing for. On the security side, I would just defer to, we have an excellent collection of security experts here to speak to, I would say, if we could speak to the phishing and the phishing resistance of the FIDO protocol and the role that phishing plays as a vulnerability even for SMS codes.
Yeah, maybe I can speak to that a little bit. This is Dirk again. So when I don't wear my FIDO hat, I work at Google, and so one of the attacks that we see on users' accounts is phishing, where people, are accidentally giving their passwords out to parties that they shouldn't be giving their passwords out to. And, that's not really their fault. People make mistakes. And SMS-based two-factor authentication systems have sort of built in the same vulnerability, right? I can create a phishing site that asks you for your username, your password, and your OTP, your one-time PIN, and then try and use that to log into your account. The FIDO protocols at a protocol level defend against this attack because the cryptographic assertion that the authenticator generates includes the web origin on that is asking for the assertion. So if I run a phishing website on fisher.com, for example, that I make to look like the login page of your bank or of Google or of Facebook or some popular website, and I collect your password from there, and I try to get a cryptographic assertion out of your authenticator, one of the defenses that the protocol that we have built into the protocol is that the assertion that comes out of your authenticator will say this assertion was generated on the web origin fisher.com. And if I then try to use that assertion against the bank or against Google or against the relying party that I'm trying to attack, the relying party will be able to see that that assertion was not generated for the relying party. It was generated for a different origin, and that's different from an OTP, from a simple 6-digit code, which in and by itself doesn't really say which website it was entered on. So that's one of the advantages in terms of security.
Yeah, and that's another aspect, that's this privacy aspect, right? If you have one mobile phone and you would provide your mobile phone number to two different relying parties, they would immediately be able to link the transaction to you because they see the same mobile number, so it must be the same user. Now in FIDO, it works slightly different. Even if you have a single authenticator, that authenticator would generate two different key pairs and not allowing these two relying parties to understand that this is essentially the same user owning a single authenticator. So for a relying party, it's not visible whether the two key pairs belong to one authenticator or to two different authenticators of the same model. So that's the privacy aspect which is built into FIDO as well.
Thank you, Rolf. We've got another question, which is, how is facet ID determined, and could it be faked?
I guess I'll take that too. This is Dirk again. So one of the aspects that Rolf touched a little bit on, I kind of jumped over it in my bit of the talk, was this concept of application IDs and facet IDs. And the idea there is that when a relying party asks for an assertion from an authenticator, the relying party can self-identify. So it can say, I am Google, or I am Facebook, or I am Bank of America. And then the idea is that the authenticator now uses a key pair that was made for Google, Facebook, or Bank of America, and no other key pair. And the idea behind the application ID and facet ID is that we allow for a little bit of flexibility here. So for example, Bank of America might have an Android app, an iOS app, and a website. And it should be able on the client end, on the device that the user has, to use the same key pair both from the iOS app and on the web page. So the way that Bank of America says I am Bank of America is it provides its application ID, which is a URL, and that gets sort of translated by the underlying system, the browser, for example, or the mobile operating system, into a facet ID. And the facet ID is the more concrete identity of the relying party. It's the particular web origin, like login.bankofamerica.com, for example, from which the assertion was requested, or an identifier for that particular iOS application or Android application. And so there's a check that needs to be performed. It says, well, is this particular iOS application in fact an application that Bank of America says this is their iOS application, or is it some other application that just pretends to be Bank of America? So there's a check that is going on where the platform, the browser, the mobile OS, for example, they check that the facet ID that the platform determines, so the platform is the one that says, unforgeably says, oh, it was this origin that made the request. Oh, it was this iOS app that made the request. It was this Android app that made the request. The platform determines that and then checks with the URL that the requester, the relying party, provides, whether that facet, web origin, that Android app, for example, whether that's part of the list of facets that is in fact given as making up, say, all the different applications that, say, Bank of America controls. So there's a loop that is closed there. Bank of America says, for example, I'm using Bank of America as an example, my facets are listed over here at this URL, bankofamerica/list of all my facets. And then the platform, the operating system of the browser, goes there, and it has itself determined that login.bankofamerica.com made the call, made the API call to get the signature, and checks whether that URL that was provided, whether login.bankofamerica.com is listed there, or whether that particular iOS app that made the call is listed there. And so that's how the loop gets closed. And an application, to get back to the actual question, an application cannot fake the facet ID. The facet ID is something that is not self-reported. It's something that the platform determines. The browser knows which origin made the call. The iOS knows which application is making the call, and so forth. So that cannot be forged. And the check whether that facet is listed among all the facets that, say, Bank of America wants to list is something that Bank of America controls itself.
Thanks, Dirk. I want to get back to sort of a follow-up on the question about SMS codes, which is some malware bypasses SMS codes by reading the text messages on a phone. Does FIDO protect against that type of malware app? I think this might be a question for Tom.
Sure, I can take this. So, yeah, there's some really interesting malware. I think it's more often seen in Europe than it is in the United States, but it's malware that is an application on your phone that requests a lot of permissions, like being able to read your text messages. And that malware is then used in conjunction with phishing to bypass, two-factor authentication to banks. They phish your an attacker phishes your password and then uses the malware app to steal the two-factor code as it's texted to you. And that's a pretty powerful attack. And how the app gets onto your phone tends to be a little bit out of scope. It's usually another type of phishing attack. So, how does FIDO fit into this type of attack where the attacker can actually get a malware app onto a mobile phone? So FIDO doesn't use SMS codes. So I'm going to apply the same level of privilege to that malware app, which is basically that it can do anything on the phone, right? So it can use the camera, it can list running processes, it can read your text messages, it could make toll phone calls so they could run up a huge bill. But the malware app, we're going to assume, does not have root privileges, because most banking-grade malware does not attempt to kind of exploit known vulnerabilities or zero-day vulnerabilities to get root privileges. So that's a pretty reasonable assumption to make around a malware app. So like Dirk was mentioning, if there is a malware app on the phone and it tries to interact with the FIDO authenticator on the device, it can't fake its own facet ID. So when it tries to get a signed assertion for, I'll use Bank of America as well, but it tries to get a signed assertion for a relying party, the facet ID isn't going to match. And in that case, the assertion that it gets back will be an assertion that can be used to authenticate to the malware, but it can't be used to authenticate to the actual relying party. So, kind of once again, FIDO comes in as being, I don't want to say unfishable, but significantly more difficult. You need to burrow much more deeper into the layers of the operating system and be able to bypass protection mechanisms that are seated much deeper than generally possible with kind of the traditional forms of phishing that we've seen so far.
Thanks, Tom. We've got, I know, a few follow-up questions to that, but I wanted to get to some of the other questions that have been submitted by attendees. Let's see, here's one. It's once authenticated, are users given a visual cue that strong authentication is enforced for any transactions that follow?
Rolf, could you speak to the relying party's independence and control over the user experience? I think that might be a good place to start in answering that question.
Could you repeat the question first, please? Didn't really get it.
Sure. It's once you're authenticated, are users given a visual cue that strong authentication is enforced for any of the transactions that follow?
Ah, okay. Yeah. So in FIDO specifications, there is some kind of user experience the authenticator can determine, and the rest of the user experience is left open to the relying party's control, either the mobile app or the web application. Now, what the authenticator controls is usually the guidance to the user, what he has to do for user verification. For example, swipe your finger or speak up to that microphone or enter your PIN there and all these things. After this has been done, all the control goes back to the relying party application, either the web application or the mobile app, which has then to indicate the authentication status to that user. So FIDO does not try to solve that and does not want to get between the user and the relying party at that stage. So that's really left open to the relying party to indicate the security status to the user. But it's very important that the authenticator, so there's a difference to the existing, let's say, a padlock symbol with SSL, where some people might want to indicate those things and convince the user that there is a connection, but in the end there is not. So the relying party can see the authentication status of that user, and the FIDO client system, so the computer system belonging to FIDO, will select the right key and will only select the right key if the SSL session is there and all the other preconditions are met. So we do not rely on a user to correctly identify some kind of visual signal like a padlock to do the right thing and not do that thing if that padlock is not there. So FIDO in this sense is much more robust and does not demand as much things from the user.
Thank you, Rolf. I think we have time. We've got about 6 minutes left. We have time for maybe 2 more quick questions. Here's one that's a sort of a combination question. Someone is asking about the FIDO protocols, whether it's only for internet or mobile usage, or whether it, there is thought about whether it can be used for sort of more in-person activities such as ATMs, and where else does the FIDO client live aside from the browser? So
Rolf, this is Brett. So perhaps we could speak to some exploration that's going on in conversation with participants in the NFC forum about seeing whether FIDO authentication is relevant for an in-person transaction from device to device, such as an NFC transaction.
Yeah, so FIDO in general is suited for all authentication methods between a FIDO server, whatever that is, but it needs some kind of identity, and a FIDO client environment. So this FIDO server could be, let's say, a bank which want to provide the opportunity to do online banking, for example, or it could be some kind of point of sale terminal in that sense, so some kind of small scale device which is trying to authenticate a user for payment purposes or other things. So FIDO really does not limit the number of semantics or the use cases on top of authentication. It just solves the core authentication use case, and that can be used for a lot of other semantics.
Thank you, Rolf. Let's see. There's a question about what happens if I deploy this in an incorrect manner. How could I do this incorrectly? Maybe Tom?
Sure. I guess I would say that the number one thing that I guess the number one mistake that a relying party could make when they deploy this is, besides kind of like the straightforward implementation mistakes where you're maybe like forgetting to check a signature or something like that, would be around the lines of, I would say, TLS channel binding. So if there's a man in the middle who's intercepting communications from a client and decrypting an SSL session and re-encrypting it up to the relying party, and they could do this either because they've tricked the user into clicking past security indicators, or they've been able to maybe put a malicious certificate authority onto their machine. But in some way, they're able to perform this man in the middle. They're in a pretty privileged position, right? So they can potentially let the user authenticate using FIDO, and then after they're authenticated, they can just send a request like, oh yeah, transfer all the money to this bank account or something like that. They're in a very privileged position in that situation. Now, FIDO actually can protect against this type of man-in-the-middle attack, and it relies on channel binding. So the FIDO device would make a signature over how it views the TLS session. I'm connected to this origin using this certificate, using this type of unique structure for this TLS session. And then that gets shipped up to the relying party. The relying party will see that information and be able to authenticate that. They'll be able to see that what they see from the client is the same thing that the client signed. And that's a very, very powerful mechanism, and it's making its way into more areas of browser security and things like that. So it's very nice to see it present in FIDO. But if a relying party did not check that information, either because of either technical hurdles like TLS termination and some difficulties there, or other just kind of like forgetting to implement it because it is additional implementation, that would be a fairly wide part of the attack surface that would be left uncovered. So I think that verifying the channel binding closes off a very popular attack method that folks are using to intercept bank credentials and perform invalid actions. And that would be one of the number one things that I would look for when I was testing a relying party's implementation, besides the kind of the straightforward mistakes like forgetting signature checks and things like that.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I've got a question just about FIDO enabling and consumers, which is, how does FIDO make it easy for consumers to discover when and which sites are FIDO enabled? For example, consumers using a password manager may have a FIDO device, but not realize when their favorite sites add FIDO support. Maybe this is for Brett.
So right now, the state of deployment is actually surprisingly high, given that we just finalized the specification in December, but we've already seen 3 massive scale deployments of early drafts of the protocol from Google, Alipay, and PayPal. So I think 2015 is really the year to see how common practice emerges for how relying parties introduce this to consumers. Because just on those 3 deployments, you have a very different answer to that question. It's really going to be up to the online service provider how they message this new capability to their users. And some of that will happen, directly off that mobile app, if that's the place where you're trying to authenticate. They have a lot of control through the FIDO protocol of how to message and communicate this new capability to their users, or on the website in the way that the login box or wherever you're going to discover it, especially when someone's adding a U2F token. So I think one of the things the FIDO Alliance can do is accelerate best practice by putting all of these companies together, those that have already gone early and those that are kind of coming in the next wave. So they can discuss best practices and lessons learned about maybe what was confusing when company A rolled this out. And we're really very deliberately trying to push for best practice implementation and deployment guidelines, not only for the membership to craft for each other, but to then publish and make available kind of for the longer tail of adoption.
Great, thank you, Brett. We are now at 10:01 and our webinar is over. There are a few other questions that were received through GoToWebinar, which we will attempt to answer offline. In the meantime, I would like to thank our panelists, Brett, Dirk, Rolf, Tom, and Heather for attending, and thank you to our attendees for your patience. And this webinar, as well as the slides, will be available after later on today. And with that, have a great Wednesday.